appreciate it, and thank you to Nigel and Mark and to the team behind you for allowing me to take part in your open day yesterday. That was really fantastic, great content. It was really great to see it. Monty and I were talking about this, and I love to come to events like this and see airports that are doing the real work of bringing the service, and not just what we saw yesterday and today, but we see Nigel and we see Mark at all these events, at Monty's events and more, really out there doing what I think it means to build a network at your airport. You're going out and making those connections. So I'm happy to be here. Selfishly, I hope to learn a little bit from you and maybe give you some perspective from across the Atlantic. So I asked Costas and Nigel what I should talk about, because I want to add value and not just talk about a bunch of US stuff to Europeans. So I thought, what translates across the Atlantic? And Costas said that the theme was headwinds and tailwinds. And I thought, that's perfect. That's a really good anecdote around which to build a talk, because I think I'll complicate it a little bit, because everybody in this room knows that it's the same air, right? A headwind and a tailwind is the same air. It just depends on which way you're facing. And for us, we faced some massive, massive headwinds over the last decade and a half. And Monse, you had the pleasure of being the depressing talk today. Usually, I've gone to so many of Monse's events and just brought the house down, just weeping and crying. So it's a tough industry, the regional side. The thin markets, everything else, those headwinds can be really, really difficult sometimes. But what we found as we faced our headwind is that we were trying to change the headwind, and you're not going to change the air. So some of the ways we found success is now we're trying to change our direction. So that's a little bit about what I'll talk about. But before I do that, Nigel told me that you would be interested in learning a little bit about what the US aviation system, particularly for regional airlines, are like. So here's a glimpse at that. Sometimes in the US, you hear people refer to the airlines like a monolith. Of course, they're not. And for most US communities, regional airlines provide the only source of air service. We go to 94% of the nation's commercially served airports. Our major airline partners only reach about 1 in 3 airports. So when you refer to the airlines, you're actually probably talking about a regional airline. And this is how we do that partnership. So unlike Europe, I think this is something that really sets the US apart. We operate with partnerships with the network carrier. So we don't actually, regional airlines in the US don't actually sell tickets, we don't hold out fares, we don't do the scheduling, we don't really decide where the vast majority of our flying is dispatched to. That's the job of the major airline partner. What they do, our customer is twofold. It's the major airline partner and then their partner. And we provide a fee for departure. And so we operate the aircraft, we have our own workforce, and they pay us a fee for departure, they keep the fare, and they feel the commercial risk. There's some of our flying is done under prorate. There we have a little bit more control. We decide where we're going to fly, we take on some of the risk, we take on a pro rata share of the fare, but the vast majority is really done under these capacity purchase agreements. So when there's air service loss, it may be because we don't have the fleet or we don't have the pilots, but the major airlines in the US decide where that service is extracted from. This is a little bit about airport funding, because Nigel said it would be of interest. I want to caveat this is not my lane. I'm an airline person, not in airport financing, but unlike in the UK and Europe, where a lot of your airports are privately held, US are publicly held, but they're not paid for out of just general taxpayer funds. There's sort of a trifecta of user fees, passenger facility charge, and the airport's own revenue raising. And the interesting thing is that the smaller airports lean very heavily on the grants, and the larger airports lean very heavily on those passenger use revenues that they get. So that's generally how it works. The most fragile markets in the United States receive something called essential air service. I think it's quite like your public service obligation routes. I don't know how those work exactly, but in the US, about 177 some routes, a large part of those being in Alaska, get subsidized service through EAS. Back in 2013, they created a rule, our Congress and its infinite wisdom, that if you weren't already in the lifeboat, you couldn't get in the lifeboat. So while EAS does provide sort of a fail-safe for some of those communities, if you lose service now and you're not already there, you're out of luck. So, so some of the criticism is that it can distort the market, and it does, and yet it's really important. So I promised to talk about headwind, and this is it. Monty is like, oh boy, here comes the 1,500-hour discussion. She's heard this a lot. But this was really the rule that reset our industry in the United States. And this was the result of a tragic accident in 2009 involving one of our carriers. And the solution to that was offered was to require first officers to have what was formerly a captain upgrade certificate. So they had to have an ATP with 1,500 hours in flight. Now there are a couple of different avenues you could take to mitigate against those flight hours. Through academic pathways, you could go to a 4-year degree program and knock 500 hours off. You could come from a military background, that takes 700 hours off. If you get an associate's degree, you take 250 hours off. We've always said that the FAA did not exhaust the full capabilities of those pathways. Certainly, how many in the room are aviators or pilots here? That is a rarity. Usually there are a couple, but I think we're all close enough to it. Okay, we got one. We're close enough to it. You know, the same hour of flight over and over and over again certainly has diminishing return. And what we saw is that the pilots we were able to hire had such a gap in the recency of their training that we ended up, rather than making things safer, we had to expend a lot of time and resources expanding our training footprint, breaking bad habits, restoring some of the skills that had softened during that gap, just to get them to where they were proficient in our initial training programs. So not only did it break a pilot pipeline that was already straining, because how do you get those hours? Well, when you were flying, when you were getting those hours to upgrade to captain, you were doing it in a supervised, structured environment as a first officer. But now you've moved the gates, so you're getting it before you're hired. So often you're buying it as cheaply as you can, or you're flight instructing. So it not only broke the pipeline, but it did inject some new risk that we had to mitigate through our training program. So that was a significant headwind that was facing us. And it really became a headwind for small communities. I started 2021 and ended 2023 because this is really the nadir of the pilot shortage, but it is not, I want to be very clear, this was not just a COVID thing. We were experiencing a pilot shortage to begin with. It was straining. 9/11 in our country kind of kicked the can, then the recession did again. We kept resetting the demand, but it was just always right underneath the surface we had this pilot shortage. 2009 into 2013, when this rule was fully implemented, it absolutely broke the pipeline, and within about 5 years or so, our carriers had parked about a quarter of the fleet. And that reached crisis proportions during the recovery from the pandemic, because what happened then in the US, the major airlines created early exit packages for about 6,000 pilots. And then when demand sprang back like gangbusters in the US, faster than the mainlines anticipated, faster than anybody anticipated. And they extracted all of those, it was like a giant Hoover. They just took every last pilot out of our ranks. And they didn't just take captains. They took captains, they took high-time first officers that were approaching captain upgrade. So what did we do? We turned to a pipeline that, first of all, is to begin with thin, and then we can only take a first officer. So we don't have the captains to pair that first officer with. We have a crew imbalance. We can't even hire the first officer. So it was an absolute collapse of capacity. And you can see here, the new pilot production is the Navy, and then that teal is the major airline hiring. And by 2023, we were about 5,000 pilots in the hole, and we parked about 500 of our aircraft. That was about a quarter of the fleet. So this was a massive problem for us. It was a massive, massive problem for small communities. You can see 19 communities went dark. They lost all of their air service. And 321 airports, that's 3 out of 4 of US airports, lost flights. And this was a substantial loss. They lost on average about a quarter of their flights. 61 of our airports lost more than half their flights. So this was a true crisis. And it didn't hit all communities the same. You can see here that the gains are concentrating at the major airports, at the large airports, and the losses were at the smallest airports. And this chart here also uncovers, I think, something very important, which is you can see that departures are decreasing across the board. Seats are increasing across the board, but routes and frequency and destination options, those are they're a big challenge for the smallest airports. And so when capacity crisis hits, it always hits the smallest, thinnest routes, as Montse said, first and worst. So, and Montse also talked about this as well. One of the biggest challenges that we had when we, sort of started to try and change the wind was to say, this is a big problem, this is a crisis. But you have people who will portray this. First of all, you have publicly traded major airline partners who say, oh, this is capacity discipline. We didn't want to serve that route, or that wasn't profitable, or we made this decision based on a number of reasons, and the pilot shortage was one of them. Okay, thank you. And then you have some of the people who are antagonists who said, well, if the people really wanted their air service, they would use it. But look at all these people are driving. We know where they're coming from. We've got the data. Well, what do you think happens? When you upgauge to parse scarce pilots, you're using too big aircraft, and they're going to fewer places less often, and suddenly I have one flight per day that leaves at 6 a.m., and if I have the physical ability, the car, and the time, I'll drive, right? So that is the way that you subtly begin to undermine your own market. And we saw a lot of that. And as Montse said, once that air service goes, it's very difficult to bring it back. So we took our message directly to lawmakers, and we had some pretty powerful opponents. That is, there are a couple of slides that feature myself, and at the bottom right, that's me testifying about 10 years ago. Next to me is Captain Chesley Sullenberger, Sully, the hero of the Hudson. He was one of our biggest opponents on this. Because he believed very fiercely in the 1,500-hour rule. So it was a tremendous headwind to face somebody who had that kind of gravitas, that was coming with that sort of public profile, and to be the little underdog of the RAA, a very small, $4 million a year budget organization trying to fight those kind of headwinds. So we had some success. We started to bolster our campaign with data. At the right, you can see those are our annual reports. And we articulated the value of air service just to the smallest communities alone. So it's not really possible to extract out just regional service, but just air service to small hubs, non-hubs, and non-primary airports drives $153 billion in economic activity per year in the US. And this is before the pandemic. It may be a little bit lower now, actually, because of the air service collapse that we saw. Over 1 million jobs, and $41 billion in direct wages. So a pretty substantial contribution to the nation's economy, not just at those smaller markets, but across the board. But as we were telling that story, we just weren't getting anywhere. And we started to think, who is this connectivity story? And I mentioned, I try to say yes when an airport asks me to come and speak. So we started to go around, and this is the second time that I appear in this deck, because I wanted you to see that this is in Barrow, Alaska. And you've got some communities like this where you just can't get there any other way but air. There are no local roads. There's nothing here. This is a permafrost runway. It's the only way in, it's the only way out, it's the only way for just-in-time goods. You name it, you get there by air. So we went to some of these remote communities, because it's one thing to talk about it from this academic perspective of this is what happens when communities lose service. Then you go into the communities and they talk about it and they tell their stories. And so we started to go there and help them amplify their message, not just the airports, but the local chamber of commerce, some of the business leaders. We held roundtables, we talked to local press, and we started to mount what we called an Inside Out campaign, which came from true partnership with the airports that were generous enough to invite us. And we went to South Dakota repeatedly. I went there so often that they called me an honorary South Dakotan. And that was a little bit, and they knew exactly why I was going. I mean, first of all, we were appreciated to be invited, but our majority leader of our Senate, a very powerful political figure, happens to be from South Dakota. So I went again and again and again, and we got their airports all fired up about saving their air service. And we drew the attention not of Senator Thune, the majority leader, but of Senator Mike Rounds, who's the junior senator from South Dakota. So he introduced legislation to help us. It failed, we knew it would. We didn't have the rest of the support, but people started to listen to us, and slowly we were changing that conversation. And I think the key was, who owns the connectivity story? It wasn't us. You know, when we were going and just tilting at windmills, talking about this is the economic impact, and as Monty said, they were saying all the right things, but then doing the wrong things. Being able to get the airports, their actual constituents that they answer to, who vote them in and out, and it's a key difference that we have versus how it works for you. But that was one of the things that started to unlock that story and make a change. So I testified last week at a hearing. These are just some of the quotes. I won't read them to you, but these are lawmakers who are not only saying the right thing, but they're following through. They introduced a $20 million workforce grants, not just for pilots, which is most of my airtime today, but also skilled technicians in major short supply in the US. And they have also introduced a law that would pass a law that would actually allow airlines to offer one of those alternative pathways to the first officer qualifications. So that represented about a decade's worth of effort that we just felt like we were tilting against that same windmill. Now, the FAA has released that. It's not, to say it's not perfect would probably be an understatement. It needs a lot of work, but it is a sea change compared to where we were before. So for our community partners, things are getting a little bit better. But I would caution that, because we see that departures overall are up about 1.5%. Seats are up a lot more significantly, but you know, just like we don't experience the economy in the aggregate, people don't experience their air service in the aggregate, and the community level story is very different. So we still have 193 airports that are below the levels that they were in pre-pandemic. And Monty, I loved your chart that showed all of the different sectors and how they're up or down. If I had showed a similar chart, the major airlines in the US have just skyrocketed, and the regionals are still below where we were before COVID, and I think that's why these communities are still where they are. Average loss, 1 in 3 flights. So this is still, you know, fewer airports are down, but those that are down worse than they were even at the nadir. So the market has reset itself a little bit. It's not too late. We do think that we can continue to rebuild this air service, especially with lawmakers who are more willing to partner with us, with airports and other community members that are willing to kind of get our back and talk about how this is important and how we have to be careful. But we continue to face, there's legislation right now that would require us to put ADS-B in our aircraft, and including in some panel spaces, there's just not room. So we continue to see these regulations that are just like you face, one size fits all. They could end up grounding the only fleet that serves the smallest communities. So with that, I thank you very much. I think we're a little tight on time, but I'd be glad to answer any questions now or at a coffee break.